Good afternoon and hello everyone. I think we are live. Good afternoon and hello everyone to the another lecture of our faith. Where we start episode. Today I would like to introduce Professor Tirthankar Roy, who is going to give a lecture on epidemics in Indian history. Professor Tirthankar Roy is an Indian economic historian and professor in economic history at the London School of Economics. His area of interest includes economic history and development of South Asia, global history, empires, environmental history, and music. He is the author of India in the World Economy from Antiquity to the Present. Besides several other books and articles, some of his major works are Economic Change in Global History and Economic History of Early Modern India, Rethinking Economic Change in India, Labor and Livelihoods, The Economic History of India from 1857 to 1947, and many others. His recent publications include Law and Economy in Colonial India with Anand Viswami, University of Chicago Press, 2016. He also serves on the editorial boards of internationally recognized journals, including the Indian Economic and Social History Review and Singer Economic History Series. So, without any further delay, I would like to welcome our professor. Sir, now we can start.
Thank you. Um, well, first of all, many thanks for asking me to give this talk. I really appreciate your thinking of me. Um, Secondly, there was a version of this talk delivered for the Mehta Desai Academy in economics in Mumbai. And if anybody had heard a part of that before, you will find some common things between today and that talk. But that talk was over 4 days and 10 hours, and what I'm going to present today will be less than an hour. So there is not a lot of direct overlap. This is there'll be a similar kind of issues, questions, and conclusions, but a lot of the details will be on a different level. Okay, so I hope I can be heard from everywhere, and then I'll switch to share screen so that I can start right away. Okay, so this is the talk today. I'll be discussing 5 questions. The first question is, why do we study epidemic history of India? And the answer is that epidemics explains a big transition in Indian history. And what is that transition? The next question will be, how do we define an epidemic? What's the difference between an ordinary disease and an epidemic? The third question is, how did modern knowledge of epidemics emerge? I'm going to suggest to you that dealing with epidemics is all about knowing these phenomena. Knowledge is very important. But when did modern scientific knowledge emerge, and what do we study when we study epidemics? I'm also going to suggest that scientific knowledge is never enough. Science was not enough, and the other part of knowledge was sociological knowledge or social knowledge. Why was that the case, and how did it fall? And finally, at the very last slide, I'll come to this question: what lessons can we learn from history in understanding a new pandemic? I mean, that of course making this subject not just of interest to the historian, but also of interest to many people who are wondering what's going on in the world today. And does past have any lesson in understanding what is going on in the world today? So why study epidemic history of India? Now, epidemics explain a big transition, and what is that transition? It is, of course, a huge change in the population growth profile. And this graph, which tracks the average annual population growth rate and averaged over decade, that is 10 years, percentage per year per decade, with a trend line added, that is in red. Now, this tracks almost 100 years of the Indian censuses. And what you observe from the red line is that there was a transition sometime in the decade of 1910s when the curve started moving upward. And that is the transition that we are talking about. And that, of course, is a massive change because the biggest uh, benefit that you can think of any kind of change, economic change or changes in scientific knowledge, should be a longer life. And that's what started happening from around the second decade of the 20th century. What was happening before that? You'll observe from the black line that it rose in some decades to around 1%, but then there was again a very sharp drop. And the drop happened because of famines, because of epidemics that had some connection with famines. But when the drop happened, a huge number of people died, and that almost took away the entire increase or additions to population that had happened in the decade before. This pattern lasted for until about 1910s, and then it changed. There were population shocks later, such as during the Bengal famine or communal riots, but that's a different kind of shock. But the trend, that didn't affect the trend. The trend had changed decisively towards rise. However, the late 19th century, there was a very different trend. It was almost no growth, and no growth, behind no growth, there was this pattern of mass death from time to time. Now, when now the it follows that the transition, immediate source of the transition is the disappearance of mass death. Um, and of course, that's not just a tremendous change in Indian history, but it's also a tremendous change in global history, for the simple reason that South Asian population was something like 15 to 20% of world population. Anything that happens to it will translate into world population as well. So that is exactly what happened. There was a similar transition in the world population as well. Now, the massive rise in the repeated occurrence of mass death in the 1870 to 1900 time span was quite clearly because of famines and diseases related to famine. Now, what are these famines? I mean, if you have basic knowledge of the history of this region, you know that answer already. There were three very large famines that happened in the Deccan Plateau region. The first one, 1876, happened in the region now called Rayalaseema. It's the southern Andhra districts, which is the southern part of the Deccan Plateau, which is geologically somewhat different from the northern and the western part, but climatically quite similar. The second and the third episode happened in 96 and 1898, which happened in the western part, the so-called Deccan Trap area. And in all cases, the famines happened because rains failed for successive monsoon season, winter, summer, and again a winter. And if you have that, that is going to be mass starvation, given how rain-dependent agriculture in the Deccan Plateau was. Now, it's also established that disturbance in the Pacific wind pattern, the trade winds, which is sometimes called the El Nino and La Nina, that also had, El Nino had something to do with the occurrence of these repeated droughts, which it does. When this phenomenon happens, usually rains fail in the Indian subcontinent. So there was widespread starvation. Now, there's no puzzles about this. We know these facts already, but the huge puzzle was the disappearance of mass death. Weather shocks of similar severity repeated after 1900 in at least 4 years. Yet, the potential dangers were largely dealt with. This comes from possibly the most authoritative book on population history. Now, what happened? How was it dealt with? Was it success of policy or success of something else? What kind of policy? Now, government famine analysis in this time was quite clear that the famines happened because of the geographical reason. Rains fail. Much of the Deccan Plateau area is rain shadow area. It doesn't get a lot of rain, and it's hard rock, so you cannot really dig wells or store water very easily. It's not a great place to build canals, and if you have a failure of rain, harvest will fail, and there will be a big problem. Now, the solution that was proposed was that you need railways so that food could be transported from other surplus regions and canals to make water supply in the in the drier season secure. Now, these two recipes, railways and irrigation, were tried in many parts of India, several parts of India, with or without a famine-related reason for it. But did this policy work in the Deccan Plateau? Is that why the potential dangers were largely dealt with? Well, the railways made a positive difference, yes. The most recent research on this subject offers very strong quantitative evidence that the railways had something to do with disappearance of famines and mass deaths. Canals did not. The Deccan Trap area is a geological region which is not suitable for building canals. Canals came up elsewhere, not in the famine-prone regions. So there was something else that is missing in the disappearance of mass death. There is another reason, and that was quite clearly that some of the diseases which were connected with famine conditions started becoming less deadly from around 1900. That's why the droughts didn't cause as many deaths as before. Now, in 1900, just four diseases, cholera, smallpox, plague, and malaria, accounted for 24 out of 40 deaths per 1,000 people in South Asia. If these four causes did not exist, the lifespans would be quite similar between Britain and India then. By 1940, deaths from these four diseases had fallen below 14 per 1,000. That's quite a sharp drop. And at the same time, crude death rate also fell from around 41 to 25 in 40 years. Infant mortality fell too. And when you look at the profile of these four diseases separately, the big four, cholera, plague, the third one attracts something called fever because the censuses or the vital statistics didn't quite distinguish between the causes of the fever. But we now know that it was largely malaria, except for this huge spike in 1918 when it was because of influenza fever. But in all cases, you'll observe that there was a drop, there was a decline in the early 20th century, followed, preceded by a rise. Now, rise is something, rise in the incidence of deaths. That is something that we have to come back to. Why was there a rise? Of course, famines were partly the reason, but why should famines cause a rise in death rate from disease? Now, so this is what we are trying to explain historically. If you are interested in the subject as a historian, then this is the question: what was happening? What explains the disappearance of mass deaths due to epidemic causes? So that was clearly one of the major contributing causes. And also, what was the relationship between cholera, plague, fever, and smallpox to famine conditions? Of course, in general, a general relationship was that when you have masses of undernourished people, then that is exposed to almost any epidemic disease, and that was partly the reason why famines caused diseases. But there were other types of links between these two episodes, and we'll come back to that later. Now, what are epidemics? Of course, it's disease caused by organisms, but it's a very natural process. And whenever that happens, we don't start worrying. There is nothing unnatural about organisms living off the cells of another body. Microparasites are extremely common. In fact, all life lives off other lives, and sometimes, most often, the host and the guest make peace and live amicably. Sometimes the relationship becomes predatory, and the guest can kill the host. Now, when this happens, the body's immune system reacts, and the host cannot perform normal tasks while this battle is going on. And that's what we call a disease. Now, epidemics are something else. This condition for possession of a disease is extremely common. It happens all the time, every day. But a pandemic or an epidemic is a slightly different level, and it's a disease with high transmission potential. So a disease that moves from host to host very quickly. There are a lot of ways that diseases can transmit. one very common way is indirect transmission through an intermediary carrier like a fly or a mosquito. And bubonic plague, malaria, typhus, cholera, or leishmaniasis, sleeping sickness are all examples of that kind of transmission. But there is also direct transmission via droplets that are released through cough and cold, cough and sneeze, such as TB or flu or smallpox, or a variety of plague called pneumonia. Now, there are also a third type of transmission, which is through an agent, which is through an object, such as water or human waste. Now, in all of these cases, the common thing that binds all of these cases together is that we do not see the organism, the intermediary carrier. We do not see the transmission channel. We do not see the enemy. We don't know the enemy. And therefore, the disease spreads very quickly before some kind of control system kicks in. Um, so, I mean, these are this long menu of epidemic diseases are not all equally fatal or equally disruptive. Many types of childhood versions of a disease, such as smallpox, creates permanent immunity. Flu is usually a very mild condition, but of course, it doesn't have to be. If a disease is more serious than this, then we have to do something about transmission. And also, people who have been previously unexposed to a disease organism, microparasite, can suffer very badly. So there is also that to keep in mind, which can make normally or very mild or benign kind of disease very deadly. Now, epidemics has long been subject of historical research, historical inquiry, partly because, as you can see from this slide, that it has something to do with how people live. And transmission has something to do with how people live, what their habits are. And you want to know how epidemics unfold by studying society. That is part of the reason why it has always been historical. The other part of the reason is that because people who are affected do not often know the agent, cannot see the enemy, they react in very odd ways, and that can have serious political and social consequences. It can upset societies, it can upset economies, directly by reducing population, destroying jobs, and indirectly via creating political problems. One very common problem, which has been studied again and again in many excellent studies of historical epidemics, is the persecution or othering effect. When an unexposed population experiences a new disease, often their first reaction is to blame an outsider, or blame somebody who is not part of the settled population. That could be the poor, that could be the foreigner, the Jew, the not quite normal people like gays or Africans during the AIDS epidemic, or Muslims or Chinese, whatever is that agent. But it falls in a pattern of reaction that's been happening for thousands of years. And of course, when you do not have a state, or the state is weak, or the state takes sides, then you will begin to see riots and political conflicts break out because of this effect. So politically, states can collapse, systems can collapse. For example, the 14th century Black Death, which is full of the variety of plague, led to permanent change in the relationship between landlords and tenant farmers or laborers, and in some view that weakened the feudalism in Western Europe. But there are many such examples. There's another kind of history that is engaged in studying epidemics, that is biological history. It changes, every disease changes the history of the human body. The body remembers the invaders, and often that memory is passed on to the next generation. So there is a evolutionary adjustment between host and parasite that takes place over generations. And sometimes that history will give you clues as to what the body can do when it encounters a completely previously unknown challenge. So moving to the third question, how did modern scientific knowledge of epidemics emerge? What do scientists study when they study epidemics? Now, as I said, I mean, the whole problem of dealing with epidemics or dealing with diseases with high transmission potentials is that you cannot see the enemy, you do not see the agent. And knowing the enemy is the first step, it's the key step. And and if you can do that, then of course you have a much better chance, not necessarily 100% chance, but a much better chance than before in dealing with the challenge. Now, this is a relatively, the science of dealing with epidemics is a relatively new development in the history of science or history of biology. Um, and and this understanding that the battle to contain an infective disease is a battle on the plane of knowledge, has been divided up into that enterprise has been divided up into answering three types of questions, and that whole package is a relatively modern understanding. It really took shape in the late 19th century. What are these questions? The first question is the question of etiology or origin, and the development of a vaccine or treatment depends on knowing what is the agent, what is the origin of a disease. The second question is sociological, which is about transmission, the question of practices and habits which affect transmission and spread. That A cluster of habits could include migration, it could include diet, choice of food and water, where do you get your water from, even control over property, settlement pattern, even religion and politics. And religion will come back in a moment later in this discussion. Now, the third question is, what do you do when you have this knowledge? And of course, public health depends on implementing the knowledge for the greater benefit of society. Um, and public health is a relatively recent institution. It's that part of the health system which implements policy or implements understanding. Now, the understanding is based on answering questions one and two. But what happens when public or private healthcare faces a situation when it doesn't know question one and question two very well, doesn't know the answer, etiology or transmission? In that case, of course, it has to adapt and it has to grope in the dark to some extent. And public health will find that some of its actions will work and some will not. And we are witnessing very similar kind of phenomena today. Now, this scientific enterprise, as I said, is a relatively recent one. That is question number one, and the development of vaccine or treatment that builds on question one. As I said, I mean, it's not enough. It's not enough. You can have a vaccine, but giving a vaccine to something like 160 million people in, say, 1880 India is not feasible. Plague is an extremely widespread disease. You can have a vaccine, but it doesn't make any difference. So often your only hope, the public health hope of controlling a disease, depends on question number two: how do you control the transmission? But science is very important because in the long run, a vaccine can be a very important tool in the battle against disease, um, but only in the long run. Now, this enterprise of identifying organisms as a cause of disease and finding a vaccine on the basis of that knowledge is really peaked in the 1880s, 1890s, and it was very much a continental European movement. It came from the enterprise of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch and many students that they had. Um, the governments didn't, especially the British or the French empires, which ruled much of Asia at that time, um, knew that this knowledge exists and that it could have some role to play in mitigating diseases in their domain, because many of these diseases were deadly in the tropical world. But they did not put a lot of money in research because because they didn't have a lot of money to spare, and B, because they didn't think that research really worth supporting. However, what they could do is create a space where European scientists could migrate, come to work, and collect data more easily. The data on some of these diseases, like plague and cholera, were more readily available in the tropical world, such as South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the empire enabled that kind of exchange. And many of you have studied or done a course on the colonial empires, and it means different things. One common sense of the empire is that of a state, a government, modern sense in which we call a state. But as a government, these most of these were, well, they were militarily powerful, but in by many other benchmarks, especially public goods, they were not really very effective governments. The other completely different sense of empire is that of an integrated field of exchange of knowledge, where talented people or people without much talent were moving around much more freely without having to get a complicated immigration process, go through with it, and seek jobs in different parts of the empire. And that applied to a part of the scientific community as well. And the scientific community dealing with it, parasites really took shape through that kind of exchange. And the tropical world and the continental European scientific world became much more integrated thanks to the empire. I'll have more to say on this subject in the cholera and plague had become somewhat rare in Europe, although they were very significant European diseases. Cholera was originated in India, it's believed. However, it was quite deadly in the 19th century in Britain. But both were, around 1900, both were mainly tropical diseases. And the scientists who wanted to study these diseases needed to come to the tropics for data. And then the other thing that made Asia quite, especially South Asia, quite significant in this whole enterprise was the connection between famine control and disease control. That knowledge by 1900 was quite common knowledge that if you wanted to reduce the number of deaths from famine, then work both on food and on disease. Some of the diseases had a close connection with the famine condition. As I said, I mean, the institutionalization of medical microbiology was a European story. It started with Louis Pasteur. Pasteur Institute began in 1888. It drew students from Central and Eastern Europe. Not many English-speaking people came there, but a huge number of French, Swiss, Russians, Ukrainians moved into these institutes, into Pasteur Institute. Koch headed the Royal Prussian Institute for Infectious Disease, which is now the Koch Institute, the main public health body in Germany. Played a similar role. Now, what these individuals did, but also in parallel sets of research, but also their institutions did, was to develop these two techniques, attenuation and inactivation, which transforms a disease-causing agent into a form in which it can be reapplied to the body and regenerate the immune reaction. This was the new knowledge that many students of these bodies understood had a tremendous application in the tropical world, but they needed data, they needed subjects. This wasn't quite a British enterprise; it was very much a colonial, continental enterprise. Now, I'm going back to the same graph that I started with, and you can see that some of the significant breakthrough in understanding the etiology and then developing a vaccine had happened in the late 19th century. Cholera identified between 1885 and 1893, and almost soon after a vaccine came. Plague bacillus was cultured in 1894, and the vaccine came soon after. Malaria parasite fever was an extremely common phenomenon all over India, but it also had a connection with famines or food shortages. Malaria parasite was identified in India in 1897 by Ronald Ross. It was also identified in Algeria almost at the same time, a little before that. Now, of course, immunization, malaria control, antibiotics, and all sorts of things were going on in the interwar period, and that had an effect in the transition that we are interested in. However, you will also see that the same time when some of the most important breakthroughs are happening is not the time when population starts responding. For the simple reason that vaccines, having a vaccine and giving it to millions of people are quite different challenges. And often these two things happen can be generations apart. So it's not etiology alone that was causing this transition. Um, but the fact remains that in the 1880s, India was identified to these continental scientists as the place to go for tests on plague, cholera, finding subjects, finding people on whom an experiment can be made, or finding cultures of bacteria, and these and some laboratories had come up, not exactly through a well coordinated government policy, but they did come up because the government thought that why not? Let's try this. Especially the British government wasn't very knowledgeable about what was going on in the Cocker Pasteur institutes, but they thought that this may be worth trying. So they gave them a space. Who are the people who came in? Now we have to remember that this is still not a very mainstream kind of research. And often the people who are doing it were, of course, continental Europeans, and they were not necessarily either friends or very close to the British Empire, the British establishment. So some of these characters who came to India to do research or went to Southeast Asia were quite offbeat. They were good scientists, of course, but they were also often slight misfits or adventurers. This is well before professionalization of the scientific research community. So you have an interesting story, a biographical side to these stories about who came and succeeded in doing research. One example, of course, is Waldemar Hafkin, who came to India to research on the plague and well, a number of diseases. Another major center was the Pasteur Institute in Pune had started from 1907 with American donation. Another major center was in Vietnam, where Alexander Yersin or Yersin came to do his research, again, mainly plague research. In Japan, there was a cluster of research on bacteriology, partly because Japan was close to China and Hong Kong, where some of these epidemic outbreaks were happening. So there was a field right next door. So the hubs of this research were really in Asia, not in Europe. But the Europeans who came there were often, um, um, Europeans came there for research, and some of them, as I say, were odd characters. Now, no one but Yersin would fit that model very well. So let me dwell a little more on his biography. Probably the most this space has been used the most in stamps all over the world. Many places in Southeast Asia, and Switzerland, where he came from, in France, where he did his degrees, have produced stamps in his honor. Now, if you look at Yersin's photograph, this is him as a young man in his 40s, and it doesn't quite look like a doctor or a scientist. It looks more like maybe a painter. And his life was quite like that. I mean, it was very much a journey in discovering what he was good for until such time when he actually became a medical microbiologist. He was born in Switzerland. He was trained as a doctor. He was very shy, very solitary figure. Had very close ties with his family, mainly his mother and sister, but he was otherwise not very social person. He was, as a doctor, he was more interested in pathology than patient care. So that he had probably understood that he has a talent there. He joined Pasteur Institute to follow up his interest in pathology. He researched diphtheria with Emil Roux and finished a doctorate dissertation on TB in 1889. At that point, he gave up all that on the excuse that Mr. Pasteur is quite right. To be successful as a laboratory scientist, one must be either a genius or a millionaire, otherwise it's a miserable life. So that kind of captures the the sentiment in which many of these early research scientists were working. So he gave it all up, and he thought that he would be something else. So he came to Southeast Asia, which was again a very common kind of response. If I don't know what to do with my life, then let me join the colonial service, and maybe they will tell us, they will give us something interesting to do. And he enlisted as a ship doctor, then became an explorer. He moved around in the mountains of Vietnam, in the Annam Mountains, which are extremely inaccessible places at that time. And he almost gave up the exploration. I mean, he moved around in the mountains, drew maps, and sometimes treated people, but not really doing much scientific or medical work. Um, he gave up during 1892 because he almost died probably of a disease, and then came back to join as a military doctor. He again was quite dissatisfied with it. Next year, he again went for explorations, and then had a battle with a group of five escaped prisoners, in which he again almost died. And finally, but during these explorations, he discovered rather some really nice villages in the mountains, which he recommended that this could be developed as holiday resort. And one of these was the Dalat town, which is in fact one of the most successful and luxurious holiday resorts in the Vietnam mountains now. Now, when he finally gave up all that adventurism and came back to join the service, he was asked to go to Hong Kong to investigate a plague outbreak. Now, Vietnam was a French colony, Hong Kong was a British colony, and already one of the most famous medical scientific figures in Japan, Shibusabuno Kitasato, was already quite famous and had been invited by the hospital system in Hong Kong to study a plague outbreak. And he had identified a bacillus. The Scottish head of the hospital did not like this awkward Yersin, and soon after, his assistant, the only person who was working with him, escaped with his body. But somehow the project had caught his attention, his fancy, and he set up this hut which you see above. It's one of the looks really unusual for a laboratory. And then he had to find subjects. So he bribed sailors to do some research on dead bodies in the docks, and then collected his data from that. Now, Kitasato had published his claim in the Lancet journal, but it turned out to be confusing because apparently the sample that he had a mixture of both plague bacillus and other types of bacteria, and that didn't satisfy the community. Yersin, meanwhile, isolated the plague bacteria. And he also did something which is quite unusual, which is to trace it to rats. He identified a connection between plague-infected rats and transmission to humans, and then pioneered a treatment for plague, which was applied in Mumbai with very significant success later on. Now, this is scientific research before scientific research. I mean, you won't probably find many figures as offbeat as Yersin, but you still find quite a few of these people who were prominent in the 1880s or 90s in Asian research were not really part of the mainstream, part of the establishment, including Hufkin, who was a Ukrainian Jew. And their worldview, Yersin's worldview is nicely captured in this quotation. I should not like to make medicine my living. I could never ask a patient to pay me for a treatment. I regard it as an office of like the priesthood. Demanding money for treating an invalid is like saying your money or your life. And of course, he lived quite quietly in this house for a very long time, which is now a museum. And you can see that it's, I mean, he died there and he lived all his life in a corner of Vietnam. Now, that was a history of how science developed. And it developed from very weak, very uncertain kind of foundations with just one big idea that if you can identify the bacteria, a bacteria causes this or a virus causes this, if you can identify the agent, you can use attenuation or inactivation techniques to find a cure for it, find a prevention for it. But science wasn't enough, and science wasn't really kicking in with this new knowledge until much later, because having a vaccine and applying it are two different things. Something else was needed, and that was social knowledge. What was it, and how did it fall? Now, that's of course all about transmission. Much of the 19th century, when cholera was breaking out in India again and again and causing really serious problems, and especially during the famines, many people, many doctors, many medical professionals. Hang on. Still here back, okay. Yes, I hope you can see the screen properly. Can you all see the screen? Okay. Yeah, okay, I got it. Yes, so many okay, back then. So a number of people who were engaged in public health or the medical establishment were also trying to understand the same problem, what is causing the transmission. And of course, the moment you know that it could be caused by a microorganism or a parasite, something like an intermediate agent, then that question becomes very much more complicated. How does that agent move from people to people, or how does that agent carry the disease? Now, that basic dynamic was well known. In the 19th century, people were studying how diseases spread, how cholera especially spread, and they did find a few patterns even before the etiology was properly known. One of them was that cholera was an extremely prevalent disease in the temple towns, and especially during the festivals. Gaya and Puri and Parashnath Hills near Gaya had repeated outbreaks of cholera in the 19th century. So there was some kind of connection to be drawn between crowds and cholera. In the 1890s, when plague returned and was very significant killer in India in the 1896, again a connection could be observed between slums and plague. Similarly, a connection could be observed between stagnant water and malaria. The causation was not known, the causal model was not known, but the connection was known. And between 1880 and 1900, as we have seen, I mean, all the four killer diseases to this list, you can add smallpox, became much more active. Death rate rose, and it was kind of guessed, but the guess was right, that the railways were spreading people much more, spreading infections much more, and that famines were driving big numbers to the cities. That had something to do with the spread of disease transmission. Railway embankments were creating more stagnant, waterlogged areas, and that has something to do with malaria. Now, in cholera, I mean, how does that knowledge translate into any kind of action plan? Um, in cholera, the connection between water, bad water, and the incidence of cholera had been known from studies in London done by John Snow and others in the 1860s. In 1896 and 98, that connection came back between water and cholera, but in a very distinctively Indian way through the famine episodes. When the rains failed, 1896, I mean, that knowledge was quite well established. In 1898 was a kind of official line that when the rains failed in the Deccan Trap region, which were normally not water scarce, but you can get water only deep underground between two layers of igneous rocks, which are very hard rock. You cannot really dig underneath. So it's not like um, I mean, it's much easier to dig a well in the Bengal Delta because you are digging through alluvial soil or soft soil. It's a totally different game trying to dig a well in the Deccan Trap. Most people did not have wells. It was very expensive, sometimes very uncertain. So there were very few storage of water. Now, when the rains failed, a large number of people had to rely not on safer water, which is available from underground, but on contaminated sources of surface water. And that was causing massive cholera outbreak. Now, this is a very peculiar famine kind of logic that was well established. The the observation that came from London, which was of course a big city, that if slums live on a single source and that source is somehow contaminated, I mean that has the cholera agent in it, then of course a large number of slum dwellers will have the disease. That knowledge was translated quite early on into the big cities, the port cities, and led to centralized water supply systems. A sanitation engineer's office had come into being, and it was doing a lot of work in the cities. It wasn't doing a lot of work in the famine heat regions because these are regions which are enormously large, very sometimes inaccessible, and just one officer in one province cannot do very much. But that is what the 1896 and 98 famines did, which is to create the awareness that in order for the government to deal with cholera outbreak, you have to do something in the Deccan Plateau, which is different, which is not a normal famine relief policy, that is supply food. You have to work on water. And how do you work on water? Well, disinfect wells, disinfect the common sources, but also requisition wells and give poor people access to these wells. How well that policy worked is another question, but that policy did work at some level, which had something to do with the reduction in cholera epidemic. Plague transmission again was completely unknown, and public policy was uh, much like shooting in the dark. The bacterial strain, Yersinia pestis, which is of course after Yersin, was discovered and the vaccine designed between 1896 and 92. But 1896 was the time when plague hit in a very bad way in Mumbai city, Bombay then, because in 1896 a huge number of people had moved from the famine-struck region into Bombay, and they moved into slums. They moved. The slums suddenly became overcrowded, and also probably some of them brought the disease with them, and then the disease spread very quickly through the city. And then it kind of raged on from that time. I mean, once every 3 years, every 4 years, it would come back and kill a large number of people until 1912 when it started going down. By then, well over 1 million people had died. Now, but the availability of vaccine didn't really bring down the disease. The the immediate problem for public health was not how to apply the vaccine. It wasn't quite easy to do that. It just wasn't available. The knowledge was available. The vaccine wasn't. So what does public health do? Well, they have to identify how it spreads. And one easy a relatively easy channel which was identified was the pneumonic plague. And when the plague bacteria um, uh, affects the lungs, then the disease spread. The disease becomes airborne, and the disease spreads through droplets. The more common bubonic plague was neither airborne nor waterborne. So how did it spread? One theory was that plague happened in poor slums, so it must have something to do with poverty and slum dwelling or crowded settlements. Um, Crowded settlements have poor sanitation. So it was quite severe, quite visible in the Bombay city slums. And as I said, a year before, thousands of people had fled the famine, moved into the city. Many of them probably had low immunity or they were already diseased. So one theory was that crowded living conditions and poor sanitation caused the disease to spread, which is true of pneumonic plague. Was it true of bubonic plague? Now, no one exactly knew what immunity, poverty, crowded neighborhood, cleanliness, sanitation had anything to do with the disease. But this was a plausible theory because this connection came up again and again. So what they did was, and these photos are from Karachi city, which had very similar problem to Bombay, but you will find similar photographs from Bombay as well. So what the doctors and public health did was segregate people. The action plan was to quarantine people. Whenever you see a cluster of disease, you isolate that, move them to a different neighborhood, and move them away from their homes, and then fumigate the homes. Those in charge of sanitation in the urban slums thought that human waste, discarded clothes, lack of fresh air, unhygienic habits of Indians would pass the disease on. So it of course, I mean, all of these beliefs kind of confirmed another belief that Indians were basically had very unclean habits. Um, and they also were very traditionalist, so they resisted modern movements, modern science. But then, these people have brought on the disease on themselves because they are so unhygienic. But the others needed protection. Europeans and richer people needed protection. So you have to go through with this anyway. So this army of sanitary staff, they drove out people from their homes, often dug up their floors, poured disinfectant upon them, all on the assumption that that's how you control the disease. The origin of the disease is somewhere in the slum or somewhere in the crowds. Now, already when this was going on, there was another theory, which was strengthened by Yerson's discovery that rats are somehow involved. And that theory built, once again, not quite on scientific knowledge, but on observational knowledge about how disease spread. And they found this strange connection coming up between plague, between grain storage, between rats who live on grain storage, and rat flea, a type of oriental rat flea which lives on the rats. Now, bacteriologists who were really developing this link, had very little political power. They couldn't persuade the public health authorities, no, that's not what you are doing is all wrong. This is the right view. But they were lending support to a view that a bacteria are transmitted by a non-human agent. And unless you can work on that agent, you really cannot control plague. Digging up slum homes is not going to solve this problem. By the time the rat flea link was solidly established, that became the scientific knowledge, the third pandemic of plague, the first two happened in a long time ago, the Black Death and Justinian plague. The third pandemic, by comparison with the first two were mainly European, the third pandemic was primarily Asian. But the third pandemic was in retreat by 1910s, when the rat flea link was well known. But when the public health authorities are wrong to insist on quarantine, sanitation, disinfection, working on people, working on moving them to safe places so that the others are secure. Well, one idea in circulation was that untreated human waste helped the breeding of fleas. So rat and flea could still be much more deadly in a slum and elsewhere. So possibly slum clearance had some effect, if that is true. Um, Most urban slums in 1896 did not have waste disposal systems. They were a sanitary nightmare. And the reason why they did not have is that much of the municipal taxes came from the rich people, the business elite, who lived in different places. And they were not very open to the idea of paying for something that will benefit only the slums. So water supply was improved, but sanitation was not. That was the story of urban development in India in India for a long time. Also, there were a lobby within the Plague Investigation Commission, the scientific lobby, which believed that most plague were of the pneumonic type in India. And of course, if that is true, the crowded slum room, an ill-ventilated room, is a deadly place. You have the disease spread very quickly. Uh, Having said all that, I mean, why the third pandemic ended remains a mystery because vaccine still wasn't effective. And as I said, the public health policy was kind of moving around, making experiments. Probably the aggressive disinfection regime, although the causal basis for it was not known, it might have reduced fleas in the urban slums. That may have worked. Maybe digging up floors in affected areas disturbed rat settlements. Rats moved around. Maybe it just receded globally, as sometimes diseases do. And while there was a gap between one wave and another, immunization had started working. So the next wave didn't come. It may be, but basically the dynamic is that that diseases came in waves, and it had to recede sometime, normally, when immunization took over. Um, Maybe inoculation or immunization did begin to work, or maybe as famines disappeared for other reasons, food supply, railways, cholera control, immunity, general immunity improved, and that affected the plague as well. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of this talk, and only one thing remains to be done, which is what lessons can we learn from stories like these? What lessons can we apply to the present times from stories like this? Now, one obvious lesson is that public health works best when you know, when there is reasonable certainty on etiology and transmission of disease, origin and spread. If you know that, then you can control, yes. But the real challenge is what do you do if you do not know and you do not have complete, reliable answers to any of these? And every time the new pandemic begins, public health is left in that kind of vacuum. We do not know. We are trying to understand. So when does that happen? Well, if a never before seen microparasite comes into the stage, if a population which had so far been unexposed to an existing microparasite becomes exposed, more migration or foreign travel or whatever it is, unusual origin, animal to human transmission, which is very hard to predict or how that is going to happen, unheard of source like bats in a Chinese cave. Um, Nobody thought that could cause a worldwide epidemic. When lifestyles interact with the lives of microparasites, and that lifestyles, of course, is a very broad basket, and you have people moving around for jobs, people traveling around, people changing either eating habits or their sexual habits, and all sorts of things could kick in the work of microparasite. And when you have public health under long neglect, which has happened in many developed which is a kind of normal condition in many developing countries, one of the definitions of being a developing country, but which also happened in the Western world after the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of money was withdrawn from public goods, both education and healthcare. And of course, if you have that given that 2008 was absolutely devastating, and that the governments overcommitted themselves in dealing with the after effects of that shock, economic shock, that it left a huge number of services completely exposed to pandemic. And then you have massive thing like this, COVID-19, and governments are just not ready. Um, why are they not ready? Because very often they have an over excessive reliance on science, perhaps, or modern medicine. They believe that it's just an overconfidence. Or, of course, no one can predict when the next pandemic is going to hit. So let's first first get the economy right. We'll worry about disease later. And the world had seen very similar kind of thing before. Here I quote from an article which was published in the Proceedings of American Philosophical Society in 1993, which is uh, a special issue of the journal, which is looking at the AIDS epidemic, and it makes this statement that it's perhaps a measure of the hubris or overconfidence of modern medicine that we were so surprised and taken aback by the emergence of AIDS. The one thing that you learn from reading history is that that attitude, that element of shock. How could this happen? It is a very common thing. It happens every time, and it doesn't matter whether how well developed the scientific knowledge is. It happens every time when you encounter something that the world, the public health were not prepared for, and they are not prepared for because they don't know what the origin is, what the transmission is. The system is not ready. So that's all I wanted to say in this lecture, and I'll wait for questions and also change the screen meanwhile. Stop sharing and let's see what happens. Okay, thank you very much. So you can start asking questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an informative lecture. Though we have some technical issues, but there are three questions. Uh, the first question is from Rakesh De. He asks that while coronavirus become a huge pandemic for the world, we see that the Black Death due to severe plague only limited to Europe. Was that because only in that time globalization did not develop, or were there more reasons?
Okay, very good question. Yes. Well, Black Death wasn't actually confined to Europe, but Europeans wrote more about it. So we have more knowledge coming from Europe about what was going on. But the Black Death probably came from Central Asia. A region in Central Asia is often believed to be the home of the original plague. And then it moved through the Mediterranean, moved to Italian ports, city ports, and then moved to Western and Central Europe. But it had it came up, it broke out the 14th century plague in several other parts, possibly in India as well, because India had a massive famine around that time. And some of the descriptions suggest that it also caused epidemic diseases. So it wasn't exactly limited to Europe, but you are right that certainly not, migration didn't exist in the way it does nowadays. So probably transmission channels were not very different, but much slower and much smaller scale than before. Yes? Shall I? Sorry, Devajyoti, you are on mute.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Sorry. The second is from Prithviraj Mukhopadhyay. He asks that what would be the future of globalization considering the current corona crisis? Do you think that it will undo globalization?
I don't think so. No, I mean the meaning of globalization that we are dealing with on an everyday basis. Of course, the term means different things to different people. But to me, as an economic historian, it means enormous rise in trade, migration, and investments, and also exchange of knowledge. I think these things are going to go on because people depend on them. We have learned to live our life with being fully dependent on this kind of global exchange or global marketplace. But also, it's going to go on because if there is a disease at any part of the world and it begins to spread, then the only way you can deal with is by exchanging knowledge across the world. And that notion of globalization, which is something that, when I talked about the scientists coming to Asia to work, that was one early form of globalization. But now that has become much more, much bigger. It happens on a much bigger scale. It happens at many levels, And that kind of exchange is going to go on because that's in some way the only way we know of dealing with pandemic.
And the last is from Krishna Mondol. She asks that we know that 1980s Spanish flu have a greater impact on the history of pandemic in India. Though between 1918 and the 2020 there are huge differences. Does the experience of 1980s matter in the Indians COVID-19 war?
Well, it matters indirectly. I mean, it's a good question. There is there is a lot that we do not know about 1918 flu pandemic yet. Um, of course, we know that it probably came to India through demobilized soldiers from First World War, and for some reason, we know that for some reason it was extremely bad in Central India. I mean, no one knows exactly why Central India. We know that it happened, it came and it went so quickly in just a few months that unlike plague, which hit again and again, cholera was a condition of life in a temple town or some of the city slums. So they were people were living with cholera and plague for a very long time, and they had a way of adapting to it, and they had a way of it created a certain kind of reaction that lasted in society. Flu pandemic came and went so suddenly that it didn't have time to create either a lot of documentation or uh, kind of mythology or stories or memory. We don't really know what happened in 1918 all that well. Um, the one thing that we know about the flu virus is that it changes, it forms very quickly. Something called the viral shift, and uh, that's one thing that makes flu a little tricky kind of virus. Of course, most flu don't kill people. It's just a minor nuisance. I mean, you have cough and cold. I'm having one right now, but it's not that deadly. But sometimes you have these strains which become deadly, and usually that had to, almost always the flu becomes so easily spread disease because it affects an unexposed population, almost by definition, because the flu changes shape. So every new flu will react on an unexposed population, and so that's a story about flu. And I think um, I mean your question is, does the experience of 1918 matter in India's COVID-19 war? I guess it matters only in that way that you have. Um, I mean, every flu epidemic will be a public health challenge because the bacteria is, I mean, the virus is changeable, and because the population is unexposed. So every time the researchers will have to understand how it is working. However, in 99 out of 100 cases, the flu bacteria doesn't cause anything more than a minor discomfort. When you have this offbeat virus which can actually kill people or which destroys the lungs, that's of course is going to be much more severe. So in that sense, yes, 1918 disease doesn't matter. In terms of scientific memory or transmission memory, I don't think we know enough to see whether 2020 can actually draw any lesson from that episode.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an enriching session and share your valuable thoughts with us. And thank you, viewers. Though there are several technical issues, we are sorry for that. And the details of the next lecture will be shared soon on our page. Please keep an eye on our page. And we appreciate you being here. And thank you again. And thanks, sir, also. Uh,
Thank you.
so
Thank you very
we'll
much.
see you in the next time.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed this. Thank you very much.